This is AP Euro Unit 3 test review. Just wanted to record this real fast just to give you something to listen to, something a little bit mobile to help you prepare. And we're just going to go through these questions and I'll share my thoughts. First question is, what was Cardinal Richelieu all about? And the two things you have to understand about Cardinal Richelieu: he was the first minister of France under Louis XIII. He was the one conducting France's campaign against the Habsburg in the 30 Years' War. And one of the things you have to understand about him is really two things. Is first of all, the state versus religion. He practiced reason of state, which is the same as politique. What Cardinal Richelieu believed about the state was that the monarchy comes first before religious considerations. And he was willing to, one of the things he was willing to do was to fight the Habsburgs. They were Catholic. He was Catholic. He also funded and assisted Protestant states in going to war against the Habsburgs. And that was all about his, that all stemmed from his theory of reason of state. What was his relationship with the Habsburgs? Well, as the first minister of France, he felt threatened by the Habsburgs. Habsburgs ruled Spain. They ruled the Holy Roman Empire to the east. They also ruled the Netherlands to the north. And so he was completely surrounded by them. He wanted to weaken them. And that's what he did. In the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, that was a major turning point in European history, because it was the end of the last of these wars of religion that had killed literally millions of people. The French Wars of Religion had killed 3 million people. The 30 Years' War had killed 8 million people. Another not as significant reason that this was a turning point was that the Habsburgs were weakened and reduced, as far as the Holy Roman Empire is concerned, to mere figureheads. And France emerged the stronger nation for the 30 Years' War. Baroque art, what did it stand for? Some of the things that we have as descriptors for Baroque art was that it was different from Renaissance art in the sense that it was turbulent. It came from turbulent times, such as the one we're talking about. Baroque art was all about turbulence. It was about energy. It was about emotion. It was about action. And there were two movements that really pushed Baroque art and made use of Baroque art. And one of those movements was the Catholic Reformation. Catholic Reformation co-opted the Baroque in order to attract followers. It was exciting to be Catholic again, and they wanted to show that excitement with high-energy art like Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. The other group that co-opted Baroque for their own purposes were the monarchs, especially absolute monarchs, who wanted to use Baroque portraiture to make themselves larger than life. You also had the Northern Baroque, or Dutch Baroque, and this was very different from the Italian Baroque. It was Calvinist, it glorified industry, and it glorified normal people. In Northern Baroque, you didn't see portraits of monarchs. Let's talk about the Dutch Golden Age. There are three ways to describe it. One is religion. The Dutch were Calvinists, and they had Calvinist values. Keep in mind that the Calvinist Church stressed simplicity, and it was a reaction to the things that it didn't like about the Catholic Church, including its ornateness and its ritual, which they considered empty, and its cast of priests who had these special powers and could do things like some transubstantiation and things like that. The Calvinist religion was completely against all that. And so the Dutch Golden Age valued things like simplicity and hard work and integrity and thriftiness and frugality, and its art reflected that. It reflected these values. It showed people working. It showed cityscapes and townscapes where things were happening, where industry was being done. It had maritime art that showed ships, and work was being done on those ships. And so those values are very much reflected in the art of the Dutch Golden Age. Absolute monarchs. How did they consolidate power? Frederick William the Great Elector, he's not a king, but he is a monarch. And one of the ways that he consolidated power was he made a deal with his nobles, the Junkers. And the deal was basically this: you let me tax as much as I want to, you let me make my army as big as I want to, and you can do literally anything you want to with the serfs that are living on your land and with the towns that are on your land. Louis XIV didn't have that option because there were no serfs in France. However, one of the things he did was he built a gigantic palace called in Versailles, and he would force his nobles to spend a large amount of time under his eye in Versailles, and he would do things to degrade them and denigrate them at the same time. And he was the one with all the rewards. So if they needed help, if they wanted money, if they wanted support from him, they better do what he asked them to do. And the other thing that Louis XIV did as far as getting around his nobles to get money, to get revenue, to make his bureaucracy larger, was that he would hire common people and the recently ennobled people who had a certain amount of gratitude towards him. Keep in mind that these monarchs are trying to consolidate power and trying to solidify their rule. And in order to do that, they need to be able to fund large armies and large bureaucracies and fill those bureaucracies with educated, sophisticated, competent people. The Ottomans. One of the things the Ottomans had that nobody else had was the slave corps, the Janissaries. They captured Christian children, then they would indoctrinate them and train them to be a loyal slave corps. That slave corps wasn't just in the military. That slave corps also served the bureaucracy. Slaves in the bureaucracy of the Ottomans were often richly rewarded. They often got to marry children of the Sultan. Peter the Great, what did he do? Well, one of the things he did with Russia was he westernized and modernized Russia, built the city of St. Petersburg. His big competitor was the very powerful nation of Sweden. He fought a war against Sweden which lasted a number of years, and an early battle that he lost badly to Sweden was the Battle of Narva. It took him 9 years to develop his army into an effective fighting force. He tested it again at the Battle of Poltava against the Swedes, and he won. Let's talk about English constitutionalism and define a few words, and I'll add some thoughts to these. The English Civil War. This was basically the Parliament against the King, King Charles I. You can also say it was Roundheads against Cavaliers, and you can also say it was Parliament against the Royalists. At any rate, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the English Civil War, Charles I lost and was beheaded. And that brings us to Oliver Cromwell. Who was he? His title was Lord Protector. He was a dictator, and he was a Puritan, and he was extremely anti-Catholic. What was the Protectorate? Well, the Protectorate was England. England was now a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, and it stayed that way for about close to 10 years. The Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution didn't happen until sometime after Oliver Cromwell died. And when he died, his son tried to rule the Protectorate for a while. The English didn't want him. They wanted their king back, so they got Charles II. He was quite a bit more Catholic than they wanted him to be. When he died, he was succeeded by his brother James II, also way more Catholic than they wanted him to be. The English Parliament felt threatened by Catholics, and they passed laws like the Test Act in order to subjugate Catholics. And so they did not at all like what Charles II and James II were doing. And finally, they got tired of James II, and they invited his daughter Mary and her husband, who were living in the Netherlands, to come in and replace him. Mary and her husband William were devout Protestants, And so that was acceptable. In order for them to assume the throne of England, they had to be willing to accept the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights basically put Parliament in charge, and it also had strict laws against Catholics, and specifically said that no Catholic could ever be on the throne of England. Parliament is now in charge. However, that does not make England a democracy by any means, because Parliament consists of still the upper crust, the gentry of society. How did Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Hobbes react to all of this? Well, after seeing all this, much of it he actually didn't witness firsthand. He observed from afar in France. He said you need to have an absolute monarchy, but not because of divine right of kings. He did not argue for divine right of kings. He had done his research. He did his scientific numbers crunching. And what he decided was that people are too cruel and selfish to be allowed to govern themselves. So you need a strong dictator who will actually protect them from themselves. The agricultural revolution, what was it? Well, the agricultural revolution was a period in which agriculture, really throughout Europe, became much, much more efficient. You were able to grow far more food on the same amount of land with far less labor. And this was for two reasons: the scientific revolution, and also because of the Columbian Exchange. One of the major results of the agricultural revolution was population growth. The population of Europe doubled between 1700 and 1835. Another big part of the agricultural revolution, and this is the scientific aspect of it, was the Enclosure Movement. The Enclosure Movement was a movement that lasted decades. It was a process that was carried on by not only private wealthy landowners, but by the government itself. And what it was a closing off of fields where efforts to take part in this agricultural revolution were taking place. That's your laboratory, that field. If you're applying new methods, you're applying new crops to that field, you don't need communal farm workers walking around all over it. So you closed it off. Jethro Tull, who was he? He was an agricultural scientist. One of the things that he developed was the speed drill, and that's a device that could puncture a hole in the dirt and place the seed at the optimal level, and it also was able to place seeds at optimal distance apart from each other. And that was just one of Jethro Tull's accomplishments. What's the industrious, not industrial, but industrious revolution? Oh, the industrious revolution is basically rural industry or cottage industry. Rural people using the extra time that they have because they're not able to farm full-time anymore because of the agricultural revolution and because of the Enclosure Movement. They're using that extra time to use the skills that they have to make certain consumer goods that will be sold on the market. That's basically your industrial revolution. The main industry was textiles, although they made a lot of other things as well. In what way was it good for the workers, and in what way was it good for the merchants? It was good for the workers because they got to have an extra income when they needed it, which was when they're being kicked off their land and not able to farm full-time anymore. However, they are also reduced to wage workers, not just to make these consumer goods, but also because of the Enclosure Movement. They no longer have a personal stake in the land that's being farmed. And so when they do get to work on the land, they're working for a wage. And we call that process proletariatization. Proletariats are basically wage earners. We're going to see that word again quite a few times when we talk about Karl Marx. How is it good for merchants? Well, it's good for merchants in two ways. Number one, merchants can now get around the trade guilds. Trade guilds dominate the production of all kinds of things in the urban centers. However, these merchants have now found a labor force that's out in the country where guilds have no reach. The other way in which they benefit is the fact that rural wage earners don't get paid nearly as much as they do in the city. So they're saving a lot of labor costs as well. Let's talk about British ascendancy. When I talk about British ascendancy, we're talking about basically two things. We're talking about the Atlantic Ocean economy, and we're talking about economic domination. And that's what we mean when we say British ascendancy. Who were the British competitors? Well, that would be the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French. The Dutch they knocked out of competition fairly early, at least as far as the Atlantic concerned. However, France and Spain were quite a bit more difficult. Mercantilism, what is it? Well, mercantilism is when you amass gold in your country, basically for national security, by selling more than you are purchasing. So more money is coming in than going out. The two countries that are most famous for practicing this, are France and England. England practices it with what they call the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts are aimed squarely at Dutch shipping. A couple of things that the Navigation Acts say is that no goods can come into England on foreign ships unless those ships are from the country that the product is coming from. Otherwise, all British ships. Another thing that the Navigation Act says is that other countries cannot trade with English colonies. One of the three main wars that go along with British ascendancy, British domination of the Atlantic economy, well, the first one that comes to mind is the War of Spanish Succession. In that war, King Louis XIV's grandson was named heir to the throne of Spain. He also had the potential to be the heir, as certain people died, to be the heir of the throne in France. And everybody knew that if those two thrones were united, it would cause a major disruption in the balance of power. Hence, you had a 13-year-long war. The conclusion of that war was that Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, was allowed to remain the king of Spain. However, Louis XIV had the promise that he would never ever, that Spain and France's thrones would never ever be united. The War of Spanish Succession also ended with Britain coming out on top and making several important gains. One of the biggest gains that they made was not necessarily territory, it was actually the asiento. And the asiento is basically a license to regulate and profit from the slave trade. So that's a major financial asset. The War of Spanish Succession was ended by the Treaty of Utrecht. The next big war was 1740 to 1748, and that was the War of Austrian Succession. The results of this war were more inconclusive. Nobody really gained much. Nobody really lost much. The big winners was actually a continental power called Prussia, and the big loser was the other continental power, which was Austria. And this was settled by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, or you can also call it the Treaty of Aachen. So that was basically a draw. The British really didn't get anything in terms of their desire to dominate the Atlantic economy. However, the 7 Years' War came along, and that was different. Britain absolutely swept the field throughout this war. They did it at great cost. They doubled their national debt, and it was more than they could possibly pay back realistically. And so they basically went bankrupt winning the war. And the other thing was everybody else hated them and wanted some payback and were looking for any opportunity to deliver that payback. And this war, the 7 Years' War, was ended by the Treaty of Paris. The slave trade. Where did most of the slaves go during the slave trade? Most of them went to the Caribbean and South America. In fact, that was the vast majority. Only a tiny minority of those slaves actually were delivered to North America. Adam Smith, finally, what did he advocate and what did he condemn? Let's start with what he advocated. The things that Adam Smith advocated were free markets and free trade, letting people do what they do best and not having any barriers to that. He believed that the government should follow a laissez-faire policy, which means hands off. And what that means is that the government should do as little intervention in the economy as it can possibly get by with. In fact, the government should really be about just three things. The government should be about protecting the country from invasion, protecting people's rights, and finally doing public works that are not profitable for private enterprises to do. Another thing he was an advocate of was letting the market run itself. He maintained that if you allow the market to run itself, it will always make the right decisions. It will always find a balance between the common good and selfish desires. And that ability to always find the right path was what he called the invisible hand, because it seemed like the market was guided with this invisible hand that always seemed to guide it in the right direction. What things did Adam Smith condemn? Well, one of the things he condemned was guilds. He felt like guilds stifled competition, and they did not let people do what they did best. Another thing that Adam Smith had a problem with was mercantilism. Its foundational belief was wrong. Mercantilism was founded on the idea that wealth does not grow. All the wealth in the world that there ever will be is already here. And therefore, if you're going to get rich, somebody else has to get poor. Adam Smith did the study, he crunched the numbers, and he found that wealth was actually increasing all the time. So that's a revelation that seriously undermines mercantilism to begin with. But the thing that he did not like about mercantilism was that it stifled free markets. It stifled healthy competition.